Settle back and allow the noise of the present to fade. Tonight we travel quietly into the past, into candle-lit halls, frost-heavy nights, and a life that begins far from power, yet slowly bends an empire toward its will. Our story does not begin with an empress. It begins with a young girl who feels very small. In the winter of 1744, the city of St. Petersburg glimmered like a dream built on ice. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across endless corridors. But beyond the palace walls, the Neva River lay frozen and silent, locked beneath months of snow and darkness. It was into this strange, luminous world that a 15-year-old German princess arrived, thin, sharp-eyed, and quietly observant. Her name was Sophie Friederike Augusta. She had come from a modest principality in Prussia, raised among simple routines and strict discipline. Compared to the Russian imperial court, her childhood home now felt distant and narrow, like something half remembered. The palace she entered seemed impossibly vast, marble floors stretching beyond sight, doors tall enough to dwarf her frame, voices echoing in languages she did not yet understand. Sophie understood immediately that this place would show her no mercy. Each morning began before sunrise. Heavy curtains were pulled back by servants she did not yet know, revealing pale winter light that crept through frost-laced windows. Layers of unfamiliar clothing followed: silk, brocade, fur, each garment heavier than the last. The dresses were beautiful, but they weighed on her shoulders like armor borrowed from someone else's life. She ate little: weak tea, black bread, occasional fruit when it could be found. Hunger sharpened her focus. She told herself it was a small price to pay. Her days were arranged with precision. Russian language lessons consumed hours at a time. The Cyrillic letters at first felt hostile, curved, angular, resistant. They refused to behave like German words, and she often fell asleep at night with ink-stained fingers and aching eyes. But Sophie did not complain. She learned quickly what mattered. To survive here, she would need more than obedience. She would need understanding. By afternoon, she practiced court dances beneath glittering chandeliers. Every step carried meaning. Every pause, every turn of the wrist, every carefully measured smile was a sentence spoken without words. Sophie watched others as much as she moved herself, reading tensions that hovered beneath polite laughter. At night, when others gathered to gossip or gamble, Sophie slipped away whenever she could. The palace library became her refuge. There, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and the smell of dust and candle wax, she felt her mind expand beyond the narrow role assigned to her. She read philosophy, history, political theory, Voltaire, Montesquieu, ancient rulers and fallen empires. She read not to impress anyone, but to understand the hidden machinery of power. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before sleep, doubt crept in. The winters were brutal. Cold crept through stone walls and into her bones. Wrapped in fur beneath thick blankets, Sophie listened to the wind howl across the frozen river and wondered if she would always feel like an outsider. She missed familiarity. She missed warmth, not just of body, but of belonging. Yet beneath the loneliness, something steadier grew: resolve. Slowly, almost invisibly, Sophie began to change. Her conversion to Russian Orthodoxy marked the first true fracture between the girl she had been and the woman she would become. The ceremony was solemn, heavy with incense and whispered prayers in ancient words she barely understood. Golden icons watched silently as holy water touched her forehead. In that moment, she did not feel reborn. She felt reshaped. She took a new name, Catherine. The betrothal soon followed. Grand Duke Peter, heir to the Russian throne, was not the partner Catherine might have chosen for herself. He was emotionally fragile, distracted, obsessed with toy soldiers and foreign uniforms. Conversation with him felt like stepping through fog, uncertain, disjointed, unsatisfying. Catherine learned early that this marriage would offer neither comfort nor companionship, so she offered it something else instead: patience. After her betrothal, her education deepened. Advisors brought her reports on Russian provinces she had never seen, conflicts with neighboring powers, fragile alliances, vast distances that defied imagination. Catherine listened carefully, absorbing facts, patterns, and contradictions. She learned Russia not as a dream, but as a problem to be understood. The wedding itself was overwhelming. Hours of ritual, jewels heavy as chains, thousands of faces watching her speak vows that felt less like promises and more like thresholds. When the ceremony ended, she understood that a door had closed behind her. There was no return to the girl she had been. Married life proved quieter, colder. Separate quarters, formal meals, long evenings listening to Peter speak endlessly of Prussian drills and imaginary battles. Catherine nodded when required, spoke when appropriate, and listened far more than she spoke. Listening became her greatest weapon. She began rising before dawn, when the palace still slept. In the quietest hours, she read, wrote, and planned. Letters crossed Europe, carefully worded, intellectually sharp, building unseen bridges. Each sentence expanded her world beyond the walls that confined her. Court life revealed its true nature slowly. Beneath elegance lay fear. Beneath loyalty, self-interest. Catherine watched factions form and dissolve. She learned which smiles were sincere and which were shields. Empress Elizabeth, formidable and unpredictable, observed Catherine closely. Their interactions unfolded like a dance, graceful, cautious, testing. Catherine never forgot that Elizabeth herself had seized power once. History, she knew, had its patterns. When her son Paul was born, Catherine experienced joy quickly followed by loss. The child was taken from her care, claimed by the Empress, and raised under constant supervision. The separation cut deeply, but Catherine did not allow grief to consume her. Instead, she worked. If she could not shape her child's future, she would shape her own. She immersed herself in Russian history, wars, reforms, failures, triumphs. She came to love the contradictions of her adopted land, its severity, its resilience, its vastness. Slowly, something remarkable happened. Russia stopped feeling foreign. It felt necessary. When Empress Elizabeth died and Peter ascended the throne, Catherine sensed the shift instantly. Peter's decisions unsettled almost everyone: soldiers, clergy, nobles. Each misstep widened the silence between ruler and realm. Catherine said very little. She did not need to. she had been preparing for nearly 20 years. And as whispers filled palace corridors once more, Catherine walked through them calmly, eyes lowered, mind awake, knowing that destiny often arrives softly, long before it announces itself aloud. Tonight we leave her here, not yet an empress, not yet a revolutionary, but no longer merely a princess. As the palace stirred each morning under a new emperor, Catherine learned that silence, when carefully chosen, could speak louder than declaration. Peter III was now the ruler of Russia, yet the crown sat uneasily upon his head. The corridors of the Winter Palace felt altered, not louder, not darker, but unsettled, as if the walls themselves waited for something to go wrong. Servants walked more softly. Officers spoke in measured tones. Even laughter at court sounded hesitant, like a sound tested before being released. Catherine observed it all. Her days followed a precise rhythm. She rose before first light, when only the guards and the kitchen fires were awake. Wrapped in a simple robe, she moved to her writing desk, where letters from across Europe waited like unopened doors. She read slowly, savoring the calm before obligation claimed her hours. Outside, winter still clung to the city. Ice coated the river. Horses exhaled mist into the pale air. From her window, Catherine watched the capital breathe, steady, patient, immense. Peter's mornings, by contrast, were loud with activity, but poor in focus. He surrounded himself with favorite officers, foreign uniforms, mechanical toys. Military drills were enacted indoors, complete with maps and figurines. He talked endlessly of Prussia, its discipline, its efficiency, without noticing the tightening expressions around him. Russia, Catherine knew, did not wish to become something else. It wished to be understood. Her appearances beside Peter were carefully controlled. She wore the expression expected of an empress consort, composed, attentive, mild. But behind her stillness, she listened. She noticed who flinched at certain remarks, who avoided eye contact, who lingered near her when Peter dismissed ancient customs with careless words. The Orthodox clergy watched with growing concern. Peter's disregard for religious tradition unsettled a people bound deeply to ceremony and faith. Catherine responded not with protest, but presence. She attended every service. She stood through long liturgies. She knelt even when her legs trembled. Candles burned low as incense swirled around her. She whispered prayers not for power, but for patience. And patience gathered allies. In the quiet afternoon hours, Catherine walked the palace gardens. Snow softened sharp edges. Hedges and statues appeared muffled, timeless. She used these walks as she once had. Reflection, yes, but also strategy. Trusted women accompanied her. Guards kept distance. Words could be exchanged discreetly in the open air where walls could not listen. Concerns surfaced gently at first. Officers worried about the army's morale. Nobles whispered about broken alliances. Clergy questioned Peter's respect for sacred traditions. Catherine nodded, asked careful questions, and remembered everything. Evenings at court grew more uncomfortable. Peter held forth at dinner, describing reforms that excited him but unsettled nearly everyone else. He spoke of withdrawing from wars the army believed it was winning. He praised foreign kings while ignoring Russian sacrifice. Catherine ate little. She drank sparingly. She watched. After dinner, when music filled the halls, Catherine often spoke with diplomats. Her conversation was intelligent, restrained, quietly impressive. Foreign observers left her presence with the sense that this woman understood Russia in ways her husband did not. Letters from Europe reflected that perception. She replied thoughtfully, building an invisible reputation that stretched beyond Russia's borders. Philosophers, statesmen, thinkers all wrote not to flatter, but to engage. Catherine valued those exchanges. They reminded her she was not alone in thought, even when trapped in circumstance. Yet the strain was real. There were nights when Catherine lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to distant footsteps in the corridors. She wondered how far silence could carry her. She knew history rarely rewarded patience forever. The birth of her second child complicated everything. Though officially acknowledged, the child's existence deepened tensions at court. Peter grew suspicious. His temper worsened. Catherine sensed the fragile ground beneath her feet shifting. Protection could not be assumed. It had to be built. In her private sitting room, conversations changed tone. Visitors no longer spoke in cautious hypotheticals. Words like stability, continuity, and duty entered the air. Catherine never initiated these phrases, but she never rejected them either. She listened, allowed pauses, and spoke only when clarity was needed. Her understanding of power had matured. True authority, she now believed, did not announce itself. It waited until it was called. The summer of 1762 arrived heavy with expectation. The city buzzed not with celebration, but with anticipation. Peter's decisions grew erratic. He alienated those closest to the throne. Every announcement lost him another fragment of loyalty. Catherine's days grew busier, but more controlled. Mornings brought briefings, afternoons brought petitioners, evenings brought quiet planning. Military officers joined her during rides beyond the palace grounds, horses moving slowly beneath tall trees as discussions unfolded in low voices. Trust formed not from passion, but from consistency. One name emerged repeatedly: Grigory Orlov, a guards officer, charismatic, devoted. Through him, Catherine felt the pulse of the regiments that protected the throne itself. She asked questions. She never promised anything she could not give, and the guards listened. On certain nights, Catherine stood alone at her window. The city spread before her like a field of sleeping stars. She understood now that her life had reached a narrowing path. One direction led to erasure, the other to responsibility she had not sought, but had prepared for. She did not rush. Revolution, she knew, was loud only at the end. It was built quietly, and so Catherine waited, calmly, completely, while fate gathered its breath.
By the time summer reached its fullest warmth, patience had ceased to be a virtue. It had become a risk. Catherine sensed the change before it was spoken aloud. The air within the palace no longer merely trembled with uncertainty. It tightened, drawn thin by impatience and fear. Even the servants, trained since childhood to reveal nothing, carried tension in their movements. Doors closed more softly. Messages were delivered with hesitant pauses. Rumors moved faster than footsteps. Peter's reign had begun to unravel in fragments. His proclamations arrived suddenly, without consultation. Officers learned of military changes after they had already been announced. Long-standing traditions were dismissed with a wave of the hand, replaced with ideas that sounded impressive in theory and reckless in practice. Catherine did not argue. She observed the unraveling with quiet clarity. Each morning she reviewed notes recorded carefully in her own hand. Names, expressions, reactions. She had learned long ago that memory sharpened when anchored to ink. Patterns emerged. Certain nobles withdrew from court entirely. Others lingered in doorways, watching, waiting. They were no longer undecided. They were only uncertain of her. Catherine knew trust could not be demanded. It had to feel inevitable. Her appearances became deliberate acts of reassurance. She visited hospitals. She spoke gently with soldiers' wives. She listened to priests who feared their voices carried no weight in Peter's court. She never spoke against the emperor. She simply reflected back what others feared to say. The guards noticed. The Orthodox Church noticed. And most importantly, the army noticed. In candlelit chambers away from the grand halls, officers met not as conspirators, but as men who believed order was slipping away. Catherine did not position herself as a savior. She positioned herself as a listener who understood consequence. Late one evening, thunder rolled across the city as rain soaked the streets. Catherine sat at her desk, quill poised but unmoving. The candle flickered. Shadows danced along the walls. A message arrived. Short, urgent, unmistakable. Peter was planning decisive actions. Some would not be reversed. Catherine closed her eyes briefly. She had known this moment would come. Yet knowing did not lessen the weight of it. The comfortable illusion of waiting, of safety and stillness, had vanished. In its place stood urgency that refused to be quieted. Her next steps would determine not just her future, but the stability of a nation. She thought of her children, of the soldiers she had spoken to, of the scholars whose letters spoke of enlightened rule and responsibility. And she thought of Russia, vast, wounded by confusion, aching for continuity. In the early hours before dawn, Catherine dressed simply. She gathered no jewels, no ceremonial garments. There would be no performance today, only resolve. At the barracks, the guards assembled with an order that surprised even themselves. Boots struck stone in unison. Uniforms were hastily fastened. Faces were serious, not excited. This was not rebellion for thrill or profit. This was necessity. Catherine addressed them without elevation or grand declarations. Her voice was calm, measured. She spoke of oaths, to country, to people, to stability. She did not ask for power. She asked for duty. And duty answered. Within hours, St. Petersburg felt the shift. Church bells rang, not chaotically, but steadily. News spread quietly, faster than proclamation. The city awoke sensing change before hearing its name. Peter was unprepared. Reports reached him piecemeal. Confusion clouded his response. Officers vanished or hesitated. Orders contradicted one another. Loyalty dissolved in the spaces between certainty and fear. By midday, Catherine rode through the streets dressed in a military cloak. The symbolism was unmistakable. She was not hiding. She was visible. Crowds gathered as she passed. There was no cheering, only watching, listening, absorbing. History unfolded not with noise, but with gravity. At the Kazan Cathedral, Catherine stood before clergy and soldiers alike. The church glowed with gold and shadow. Candles filled the air with warmth and scent. When she spoke her oath, her voice did not waver. She pledged to rule in accordance with Russia's traditions, its faith, and its future. The words carried weight because they were believed. Peter was arrested without bloodshed. His resistance collapsed almost as quietly as it had begun. Once alone with his thoughts, his authority dissipated like fog at midday. Catherine ensured his safety. Power gained through restraint, she understood, was power that endured. That night, when the city settled, Catherine sat alone once more. The crown now existed, not yet placed upon her head, but undeniable. She felt no triumph, no celebration, only exhaustion. She had crossed the line she could never uncross. Sleep came unevenly. Faces passed through her dreams, those she had reassured, those she had disappointed, those she would never know. The weight of command settled into her bones, heavy but steady. Morning light found her already awake. Russia awaited its ruler, and Catherine, no longer waiting, prepared herself to become what history would demand of her.
Power, once claimed, has no interest in offering rest. Catherine discovered this in the first quiet hours of her reign, when the city still slept, but her mind refused to follow. The palace felt different, no longer a place she navigated carefully, but one that now waited for her decisions. Every corridor seemed heavier, every closed door filled with expectation. She did not yet wear the full regalia of rule. That would come later. For now, she dressed plainly, wrapping herself in familiar fabrics as though to anchor herself to the woman she had been only days before. The dawn broke pale and tentative over St. Petersburg. Catherine stood by the window, watching river mist unravel slowly into the air. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, Russia stirred. A knock interrupted the stillness. The first petitions arrived almost immediately. They came from everywhere. Military officers seeking confirmation of rank, priests requesting assurances, nobles attempting to secure favor before uncertainty could erase their standing. Catherine received them one by one, listening more than she spoke, asking careful questions that revealed intention rather than impatience. She understood something instinctively now. The throne was not a seat of command. It was a place of balance. Too much decisiveness would frighten. Too little would invite chaos. She moved with deliberate calm. Her first decrees were subtle, measured. She restored religious observances that had been dismissed under Peter's rule. She confirmed military traditions rather than replacing them. Stability, she knew, would heal faster than reform. Beyond the palace, reactions unfolded slowly. Some welcomed her rule with quiet relief. Others waited, cautious. A few regarded her with thinly disguised disbelief. She was, after all, a woman, and a foreign-born one at that. Catherine did not contest these judgments openly. She allowed time to answer them. Letters arrived steadily. Foreign courts responded with polite curiosity, carefully composed congratulations, thinly veiled questions about permanence. Catherine replied diplomatically, assuring continuity while offering no unnecessary promises. She controlled information as carefully as tone. Her nights grew shorter. At supper, she ate sparingly, distracted by reports read between courses. Maps appeared across polished tables. Advisors spoke in low voices. Decisions were recorded, sealed, dispatched, all before most of the city had finished its evening meal. Yet in quiet moments, doubt pressed in. Was the loyalty she felt real or only temporary? Would the army remain faithful once novelty faded? Would Europe accept her legitimacy? Catherine did not dismiss these doubts. She catalogued them. Sleep, when it came, was light and fractured. She woke often, mind racing with futures yet unwritten. But she trained herself to rise calmly, refusing to show exhaustion. Leadership, she believed, was as much about perception as action. To steady herself, Catherine returned to her old companion, study. She ordered books brought from the library, law, governance, philosophy. Nights found her seated beneath lamplight, reading not as an escape, but as preparation. Wisdom from distant centuries eased the pressure of immediacy. Past rulers whispered counsel across time. Outside, St. Petersburg adjusted to its new reality. Whispers faded into measured conversation. Shopkeepers reopened stalls with tentative confidence. Soldiers stood straighter at their posts. The city exhaled. But danger had not vanished. Peter, though imprisoned, remained alive. His existence cast a long shadow, one Catherine could not ignore. Advisors debated his fate. Some urged harsh finality. Others counseled restraint. Catherine listened without haste. She chose mercy not from softness, but from calculation. A violent end would stain the beginning of her reign. Stability required patience, even when fear whispered otherwise. Still, she strengthened her position quietly. Guards rotated with care. Alliances solidified through trust rather than threat. She rewarded loyalty consistently, not extravagantly. Gradually, something rare occurred. Order took root. One evening, Catherine walked alone through the palace garden. The sky was clear, stars crisp against deep blue. The air carried the scent of summer blooms, fragile but persistent. She paused beside a fountain and allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought of the young girl who had arrived frightened and determined, of the years spent watching, learning, waiting, of the moment silence had finally broken. The crown was not a triumph, it was a responsibility that pressed downward, asking more each day. And Catherine answered it, not with grandeur, but with steadiness. In the weeks that followed, Catherine held counsel repeatedly, establishing patterns that would soon feel permanent. Her voice grew more confident, her presence more assured. Advisors no longer questioned her authority, they adjusted to it. When she was formally proclaimed Empress, the ceremony unfolded beneath golden domes and ringing bells. Catherine stood composed as the weight of the imperial crown touched her head. The sound filled the air. Not applause, not celebration, but confirmation. That night, Catherine returned to her chambers alone. She removed the crown carefully and placed it on a cushion. For a long moment, she simply looked at it. Metal and jewels. It held no magic. Power, she knew now, did not reside in the crown. It lived in the choices made when no one was watching. She extinguished the candles one by one and lay down, allowing sleep, at last, to claim her, even as history began writing her name in heavier ink. True transformation rarely announces itself. It arrives softly, in paperwork and policy, in habits reshaped over years rather than moments. Catherine understood this instinctively. In the early months of her reign, she resisted the temptation to act dramatically. The nation had endured uncertainty. What it needed now was predictability. So she ruled not with sweeping declarations, but with incremental decisions that gradually restored trust. Each morning began in near silence. Catherine rose before the palace stirred, reviewing dispatches delivered overnight. She read slowly, marking margins with precise notes, questions, observations, concerns. Her mind moved methodically, resisting urgency that offered little reward. Reform, she believed, must never frighten those it hoped to improve. Councils were reorganized, not dismissed, not overturned, reshaped. Advisors were chosen for competence rather than lineage. Loyalty mattered, but understanding mattered more. Catherine listened carefully to disagreement. She believed dissent, when honest, was a form of dedication. She spoke less than expected and thought more. Her correspondence grew legendary. Letters left the palace daily, written in her own hand whenever possible. She exchanged ideas with philosophers across Europe, engaging not as a sovereign above thought, but as a participant within it. Enlightenment ideas intrigued her, not as dogma, but as tools: reason, order, human dignity. Ideas, she knew, were safest when applied thoughtfully. Education became her quiet ambition. She supported the founding of schools not merely for nobles, but for professionals, engineers, administrators, doctors. Knowledge, she believed, was a stabilizing force. An educated state functioned better, argued less blindly, and endured longer. Yet Catherine was realistic. Russia was vast and uneven, bound by tradition as much as law. Reform too swift would fracture it, so she moved patiently. In the provinces, reports arrived describing both progress and resistance. Catherine read them all. She understood that laws written in capitals traveled slowly across frozen plains and remote villages. Change required not just instruction, but trust. Nobility demanded reassurance that reform would not strip them of identity. Catherine obliged selectively, confirming privileges even as she subtly adjusted their responsibilities. Power was not removed, it was redirected. At court, life regained rhythm. Music returned to the halls. Foreign ambassadors noted the calm. The palace settled into a steadiness that had been absent for years. Catherine presided over gatherings with relaxed authority, allowing conversation to unfold naturally. Her presence guided without overshadowing. She watched how people behaved when they believed no one was directing them. Those moments revealed more than any report. Yet, beneath the serenity, questions lingered. Russia's legal system remained chaotic, contradictory laws layered across centuries. Catherine envisioned order where confusion had taken root. She commissioned a comprehensive legal review, inviting representatives from across the realm. The project was monumental, idealistic, and likely impossible in full. But Catherine believed the attempt itself would shape the nation's understanding of fairness. When exhaustion pressed in, Catherine returned to her private refuge: books, quiet rooms, candlelight. Sleep came gently on some nights, elusively on others. Leadership followed her into dreams, demanding answers even at rest. Sometimes she felt isolated. Power, she discovered, created distance even as it gathered influence. Few spoke freely now. Fewer still contradicted her openly. She learned to read intention behind politeness, sincerity behind restraint. And she missed being unseen. Still, she pressed forward. She addressed the condition of the serfs with caution. Their suffering was undeniable, their bondage entrenched. Catherine understood both the moral urgency and the political danger. To act rashly would provoke unrest the nation could not afford. So she observed, studied, delayed, not from indifference, but from calculation. The army remained loyal. Officers respected her steadiness. Soldiers trusted her restraint. She honored tradition while modernizing logistics quietly, ensuring strength without spectacle. Evenings ended with reflection. Catherine often stood at her window, watching the city lights shimmer along the river. The empire felt immense from that height, beautiful, heavy, unfinished. She knew she would never perfect it, but she could shape its direction. Gradually, The name Catherine came to carry weight not from fear, but expectation. Subjects began believing that thought preceded command, that stability was intentional, not accidental. This belief became her greatest achievement so far. And yet, history, she knew, never pauses for long. In the distance, tension stirred, unspoken resentments, borders uneasy, human ambition as restless as ever. As Catherine extinguished her candle at night, she accepted a truth that guided her reign. Progress was not a destination, it was a practice, and she would need to practice it patiently, relentlessly, for the rest of her life.
Stability, once established, creates the illusion of permanence. Catherine knew better. As her reforms settled into daily life, she became increasingly aware of what lay beneath them. Tensions not erased, only quieted. Every nation carried such undercurrents, she believed, but Russia's were vast, shaped by distance, hardship, and memory. Reports from the provinces arrived with a familiar rhythm. Some spoke of improved administration. Others described dissatisfaction, subtle, often unspoken, but persistent. Catherine read them all with equal care. Order, she understood, did not mean harmony. The countryside felt far from St. Petersburg. Decisions made beneath crystal chandeliers traveled slowly across frozen roads, altered by interpretation and necessity. Catherine knew that policy, however enlightened, meant little if it arrived misunderstood or unmet. She increased communication. Provincial officials were required to submit clearer reports. Catherine encouraged honesty, discouraging flattery. Information, she believed, was the currency of responsible rule. Yet honesty uncovered discomfort. Landowners resisted oversight. Officials feared accountability. Old habits clung stubbornly to tradition. Catherine saw these frictions not as failures, but as symptoms of transformation. Change, after all, often felt like loss. At court, opposition wore politeness. Nobles bowed deeply, praised her wisdom, then retreated to private chambers where doubts resurfaced. Catherine sensed where conversations paused abruptly. She noted who avoided certain topics. She did not confront them. Not yet. Far beyond the palace walls, tensions gathered among the rural population. Crops failed in some regions. Demands increased while conditions stagnated. Catherine's reforms promised hope, but hope required patience few possessed. Discontent rarely announced itself politely. It whispered first. Catherine often thought of the vastness of her realm, forests stretching endlessly, villages separated by days of travel, voices rising and fading beyond immediate reach. The empire was not a single body, but many, bound loosely together. To rule it demanded both vision and restraint. Advisors urged firmness. Military strength could enforce compliance. Catherine listened and declined. Force resolved moments, she believed, not futures. Instead, she focused on improving administration, fairer tax collection, better oversight, gradual expectations rather than sudden demands. The process was slow, imperfect, and often thankless. Still, it mattered. She traveled as much as decorum allowed, not far, but visibly. When citizens saw her presence, not in glory, but in attention, trust formed quietly. She listened to grievances, promising little, yet delivering consistency.
Her measured response unsettled some and reassured others. At night, Catherine felt the weight of contradiction. She wished to reduce suffering, yet knew her power was finite. Every choice excluded another. Every improvement revealed another deficiency. The empire expanded, even as unity strained. Along distant borders, unrest brewed. Neighboring powers tested boundaries, uncertain how firmly Catherine's authority held. Diplomacy thickened with calculation. Negotiations unfolded slowly, deliberately. She did not rush into conflict. Patience, again, was her weapon. Back at court, moments of isolation returned. Catherine's position allowed few equals. Conversations became increasingly careful around her. Even those loyal spoke with restraint. Leadership, she realized, was lonely not because of distance, but because of responsibility. She began writing more privately, reflections not meant for public eyes, thoughts about justice, about limits, about the gulf between ideals and practice. Writing allowed her to release what she could not speak. Sleep came more deeply these days, but never fully unburdened. Even in rest, her mind traced roads across the empire, weighing decisions yet unmade. Then slowly, word arrived of unrest too large to ignore. Isolated disturbances first, then patterns. Local resistance hardening into defiance. Catherine studied these reports carefully, mapping cause to effect. Discontent had found voice, and voice, once given, rarely fell silent on its own. Catherine prepared not for suppression, but understanding. What drove this resistance? What misunderstanding had widened into anger? She summoned advisors, requested clarification, sought alignment. Some urged immediate force. She delayed. History, she knew, watched rulers closely in moments like this, not for their strength, but for their judgment. She did not yet know how events would unfold, but she understood one thing clearly. A ruler's greatest test was not creating order. It was preserving it without losing the very people it claimed to protect. As winter approached once more, Catherine stood at her window, watching the river darken beneath early ice. The city shimmered calmly, but beneath that surface, currents moved. And Catherine, ever watchful, prepared to meet them.
The warnings arrived long before the crisis did. Catherine saw them in the narrowing tone of reports, in the repetition of the same concerns from different provinces, in the careful way officials avoided describing the full scope of unrest. When descriptions grew vague, she knew, it is because truth has become difficult. By winter's edge, whispers had hardened into certainty. Uprisings, small but determined, were spreading across distant regions. They were not unified in cause, but in frustration. Heavy burdens, broken promises, and the weight of distance combined into voices that demanded to be heard. Catherine listened, not as an empress threatened, but as a steward tested. In council, debate intensified. Maps spread across tables, names circled in ink, strategies proposed with urgency that bordered on fear. The room filled with competing voices, some pleading for swift military response, others urging negotiation. Catherine raised her hand once. Silence followed. She spoke quietly, reminding them of scale, of consequence, of memory. Force could quiet unrest, yes, but scars last longer than obedience. She asked for context, for understanding, for clarity before command. It unsettled them, but it focused them. She ordered envoys first, information gatherers rather than enforcers. She demanded truth without exaggeration, insight without panic. Days passed. The reports returned, heavier this time. Unrest was deeper than anticipated. Charismatic leaders emerged. Narratives spread, some grounded in truth, others shaped by resentment. Catherine recognized the danger. Stories traveled faster than soldiers. She issued measured proclamations, firm but humane. Acknowledgement, she believed, preceded authority. She spoke of responsibility, of fairness, of hearing voices without yielding order. Whether it would be enough remained uncertain. Privately, Catherine prepared for all outcomes. Regiments were quietly repositioned, not for intimidation, but readiness. She communicated carefully with commanders, emphasizing discipline and restraint. These were her soldiers, and she expected them to behave as such. Nights grow restless. Catherine slept lightly, waking to the crackle of firewood and the distant bells that marked the hours. She understood that moments like this defined legacies, not intentions. One evening, alone with candlelight, she reread letters she had exchanged with European thinkers years earlier. Words about justice, human nature, and governance. She wondered if ideals could survive reality. She believed they could, but only when adapted. Eventually, confrontation became unavoidable. In one region, rebellion grew bold enough to demand attention. Authorities were pushed aside. Order collapsed vocally. Catherine's advisors urged decisive response. This time, she agreed, but her orders were precise. Advance carefully. Protect civilians. Suppress violence, not grievance. The response was swift, but controlled. Disorder was met with firmness rather than fury. Leaders of the unrest were captured, not executed publicly, but imprisoned quietly. Catherine made an example not of punishment, but of proportion. The empire held. Yet the experience changed her. She saw clearly now the distance between ruler and ruled, between intention and outcome. Reforms felt slower than suffering, laws weaker than hunger. She did not grow cynical. She grew resolute. Following the crisis, Catherine expanded relief efforts, grain redistribution, tax reassessment, structural improvements, uneven but meaningful. She knew these steps would not heal everything, but they mattered. At court, opinions shifted. Those who had doubted her restraint now respected her judgment. Those who sought force recognized her strategy. Catherine's authority strengthened not from fear, but from credibility. Still, she carried the memory, the knowledge that order was fragile, that patience had limits, that understanding must be balanced with firmness, or chaos would return. One night, as winter deepened, Catherine watched snowfall blanket the city. The sounds of St. Petersburg softened beneath white silence. For a moment, the world seemed suspended. She allowed herself to rest, deeply, fully, not because problems were gone, but because she had met them without losing herself. And in that rare quiet, Catherine understood something essential. To rule wisely was not to avoid conflict. it was to endure it and remain human.
Once stability returned, ambition inevitably followed. For Catherine, ambition did not arrive as hunger, but as responsibility expanded. An empire that endured unrest and emerged intact rarely remained inward-looking. Russia was vast, growing stronger, more confident, its edges pressing outward not from restlessness, but from gravity. Catherine felt that pull. Maps became more prominent in her chambers, not as trophies, but as questions. Borders were not lines to her, they were promises of security, influence, and survival. History had taught her that empires either shaped their surroundings or were shaped by them. She preferred intention to accident. Diplomacy took center stage. Foreign envoys arrived bearing measured words and carefully concealed concerns. Catherine received them with the same composure she had cultivated for years, warm, thoughtful, unhurried. She listened. While others spoke of glory, Catherine spoke of balance, access to warm water ports, protection of borders, stability for the future. These were not dreams of conquest, but calculations of endurance. Still, expansion carried cost. Military planning intensified. Officers trained not just for battle, but logistics. Catherine insisted on preparation over bravado. Wars, she knew, were not won by enthusiasm alone, but sustained by supply, morale, and discipline. As campaigns unfolded beyond the borders, Catherine remained in St. Petersburg, awake long after sunset, reading dispatches by lamplight. Each report carried numbers, names, and consequences. Victories were acknowledged quietly. Losses weighed heavily. She never celebrated war. She endured it. The city continued its rhythm. Music still drifted through corridors. Diplomacy and culture flourished side by side. Catherine supported the arts, believing beauty grounded power. Theaters opened. Collections grew. Scholars gathered. Russia, she hoped, would be remembered not only for strength, but for mind. Yet behind cultural refinement stood reality. Soldiers marched. Borders shifted. Lives changed far from courtly chandeliers. Catherine did not romanticize this. She understood that greatness carved itself from human cost. The knowledge followed her into sleep. Some nights, dreams brought landscapes she had never seen, fields under foreign skies, quiet villages waiting for news. She awoke with heaviness in her chest, steadying herself before the day reclaimed her. Criticism followed success. European courts debated her intentions. Some admired her restraint. Others feared her resolve. Catherine accepted both. To be watched meant to matter. She refined alliances, balancing power carefully, never allowing loyalty to harden into dependence. Within Russia, pride grew. Victory, when responsibly framed, united people. Catherine ensured narratives emphasized security and continuity, not domination. She honored officers while reminding them of restraint. Power, she repeated, was strongest when controlled. She saw herself not as conqueror, but caretaker of consequence. As years progressed, Catherine's presence became synonymous with direction. Her voice carried without raising volume. Decisions no longer needed explanation. They had earned trust. But solitude returned nonetheless. Leadership at that scale always does. Late one evening,
Catherine stood before a newly completed gallery, paintings gathered from across Europe. Light reflected softly on gilded frames. She walked slowly, hands folded, absorbing not luxury, but legacy. She wondered how history would remember her. As a reformer? A ruler? A woman who held an empire together by patience? The answer mattered less than truth. She returned to her chambers and wrote long into the night. Letters, notes, reflections. Words steadied her, as they always had. In writing, she found a version of herself beyond expectation. As dawn neared, the city slept deeply. Snow softened rooftops. River ice gleamed faintly under moonlight. The empire rested, and Catherine, older now, steadier, allowed herself to rest as well, knowing that greatness was not measured by expansion alone, but by what endured when ambition fell silent.
Power changes its shape as years pass. For Catherine, authority no longer felt heavy in the same way it once had. It had settled, distributed evenly across habit, expectation, and memory. Decisions came with less struggle, but reflection arrived more often. The question was no longer how to rule, but what would remain. Morning light still found her awake. Age had softened her features, but sharpened her patience. She moved more slowly through the palace now, not from weakness, but from deliberation. Every step carried history. Every corridor echoed with choices already made. The court had changed with her. Faces familiar and strange blended together. Some who had risen with her were gone, lost to time, illness, or distance. Others stood where they stood because of her, shaped by years under her rule. Catherine saw in them reflections of her influence, both intentional and accidental. That thought stayed with her. She thought often of legacy, not as monument, but as momentum. Would Russia continue along the path she had laid, or would it turn sharply once her hand was gone? The question followed her into quiet moments. She reviewed institutions she had strengthened. Education had expanded, uneven but meaningful. Administration functioned with greater cohesion. Culture had flourished in ways unimaginable when she first arrived as a frightened girl. Yet imperfections remained. The condition of the serfs continued to trouble her deeply. Time had narrowed her options rather than widened them. Reform at this stage required upheaval, an upheaval she feared might fracture the order she had spent decades building. The burden of restraint weighed heavily now. She had learned that not all good intentions could be fulfilled without harm. That wisdom, bitter as it was, did not bring peace, but understanding. Catherine turned inward. She spent more time writing, memoirs, reflections, private notes, not for publication, but for honesty. Writing allowed her to trace the arc of her life without ceremony or judgment. In those pages, she was not an empress. She was simply a woman remembering. She recalled the early winters, the cold, the fear, the determination, the long years of waiting, the careful silence, the moment when patience had ended and destiny had stepped forward. She remembered the cost. Power had given her reach, but taken simplicity. Trust had been earned, but intimacy lost. Every relationship had bent beneath her position. Even affection carried calculation. And yet, she did not regret choosing responsibility. Catherine found peace in evening rituals, candles lit in sequence, windows opened briefly to cool air,
a single book chosen not for governance, but for beauty. These moments grounded her as nothing else could. Sleep came more easily now, deeper, slower. In dreams, she sometimes walked through places she had known long ago, her childhood rooms, quiet gardens, moments unburdened by expectation. She woke gently, carrying those memories like pressed flowers. The empire functioned steadily. Others handled daily affairs. Catherine intervened when necessary, not constantly. She trusted the structure she had built, an achievement she valued more than control. Visitors still arrived seeking counsel, younger rulers, diplomats, thinkers. Catherine spoke to them with clarity, softened by time. She no longer argued to persuade, she offered perspective. History, she knew, had its own rhythm. As seasons turned, Catherine sensed her body slowing, not failing, but settling. She welcomed it. The constant vigilance of her earlier years had given way to reflection. She stood once more at her familiar window, watching the river flow free of ice. The city breathed below, alive and enduring. Russia would continue. That knowledge brought her comfort. She did not demand admiration from the future. She asked only that intentions be understood, that patience be remembered, that effort be acknowledged even where success had been incomplete. On a quiet night, with the palace wrapped in silence, Catherine closed her eyes and rested, not as ruler, but as witness to her own long journey. Time, she had learned, does not ask for permission. It only asks what you leave behind.
In the end, power releases its hold not with drama, but with silence. Catherine sensed this long before her body began to tire. Authority no longer felt like something she carried. It had become something others upheld in her absence. The empire moved forward each day without waiting for her hand to guide it, and that, she knew, was the mark of endurance. The palace still woke early. Bells rang, couriers arrived, councils assembled, but Catherine's role shifted almost imperceptibly from architect to guardian, present, attentive, but no longer pressing forward. She accepted this change without resistance. Her mornings were quieter now. Letters arrived, but fewer required immediate reply. Advisors spoke calmly, confident in systems that had learned to function. Catherine listened with the careful attention she had always favored, offering guidance sparingly. She understood that knowing when to step back was its own form of wisdom. Time slowed around her. She took longer walks through the palace gardens, pausing to observe growth she had not noticed before. Trees planted early in her reign now stood tall, their branches spreading wide. She saw in them a reflection of her efforts, roots unseen, strength growing quietly. In the afternoons, she returned to her desk, not to command, but to write. Memory flowed gently now, no longer strained by urgency. She wrote not to preserve glory, but to record truth as she understood it. History, she believed, needed honesty more than praise. Her health declined gradually, without alarm. Physicians spoke softly. Catherine listened, calm and attentive. She had lived long with responsibility. Her body followed its own law now. She did not fear what came next. What troubled her only briefly was uncertainty, not for herself, but for what followed. She reviewed succession carefully, ensuring continuity would not fracture the stability she had guarded so long.
Then, satisfied, she let go. On one of her final evenings, Catherine sat near the window she had favored for decades. Outside, the city glowed faintly beneath twilight. The river moved steadily, unchanged by generations. She thought of beginnings. A young girl arriving from far away. A language learned by candlelight. Silence chosen over impulse. She thought of the moment everything shifted, and the many moments that followed, quieter, but just as decisive. Power, she realized, was never the story. Endurance was. As night deepened, Catherine lay down to rest. There were no declarations, no final commands, only the steady comfort of stillness. The next morning, Russia woke to a world that continued. That, she believed, was enough. Her reign had not been perfect. No reign ever was, but it had been intentional, considered, patient. And in a nation shaped by extremes, patience had become its quiet strength. Catherine's life closed not with thunder, but with continuity. A lesson she had spent a lifetime learning and leaving behind.